There's a certain weight that comes with pretending everything in your life is perfect, when deep down, cracks are splitting it apart. My name is Elena, and on the outside my life might look picture perfect. A devoted husband, 2 stepsons, and a beautiful home. But appearances can be deceiving. It started with something small, something I should have brushed off. A missing pair of underwear. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe lost in the laundry or stuck in the dryer. But then I saw Yahir, my older stepson, hurrying out of the laundry room one afternoon, his face flushed red. I wanted to ignore it, I really did. But that night, when the nagging feeling wouldn't let go, I checked his room. What I found made my stomach twist. Tucked in the back of his closet, hidden under old clothes, were my missing pieces, several pairs of my underwear. I froze. I should have walked out, waited for my husband to come home, and let him deal with it. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. And then Yahir walked in. His eyes locked on mine, and his face drained of color when he saw what I was holding. Shame, fear, and something else I couldn't name flashed across his face. Neither of us spoke at first. But when he finally broke the silence, his voice was barely a whisper. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, he said. I don't know. I just needed something that felt close to, something real. His words hit me harder than I expected. I should have been angry, disgusted. Instead, all I felt was pity, and maybe something worse. I told him it couldn't happen again, that he'd crossed a line. But then I made a mistake that changed everything. I asked if he needed help. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. At least, that's what I told myself later. But the way his eyes lit up when I said it, I knew I couldn't take it back. To be continued. I regretted my words the second they left my mouth. But Yahir didn't hesitate. Help, he asked, his voice shaky but eager, like he'd been waiting for me to say something. Anything that didn't push him away. I tried to clarify, tried to make it sound innocent. I mean, maybe I can get you something more appropriate. Something that helps with whatever you're feeling. He didn't stop me. He didn't even question it. He just nodded. And I let it happen. A week later, I stood in a store I'd never thought I'd step into, clutching a small, discreet box in my hands. My heart pounded as I paid for it, convincing myself this would fix everything. When I gave it to him, I didn't meet his eyes. I couldn't. It's better this way, I said quickly. Safer. He took it without a word, but the way his fingers brushed mine made my skin prickle. For a while I thought that was it, that the problem was solved. But then the text came. It was late. Edwin, my husband, was out of town for work again. I was in bed, scrolling mindlessly when my phone buzzed. I saw Yahir's name and felt relief. Maybe it was something innocent. Maybe he'd moved on. But it wasn't. It was a video. My heart pounded as I opened it, and my breath caught when I saw what it was. Yahir, using the toy I'd bought him. I should have deleted it. I should have blocked his number and told Edwin everything. Instead, I hit play. Once. Twice. And before I knew it, my hands were shaking. Not out of anger, but something far, far worse. The next morning, Yahir acted like nothing had happened. But when our eyes met over breakfast, I saw it. That flicker of confidence. He knew. And the worst part, so did I. I avoided him after that night. For days, I stayed busy, cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, folding laundry that was already folded. I avoided the kitchen when he was home and locked my bedroom door at night. But it didn't matter. Yahir noticed. Did I do something wrong? He asked one evening, leaning against the counter as I chopped vegetables. I fumbled with the knife, nearly slicing my finger. No, I said too quickly. Why would you think that? He shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave mine. Later that night, another text came. I didn't mean to make things weird. I just wanted to show you I was grateful. That's all. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My heart raced as I typed and deleted half a dozen responses before settling on something safe. It's fine. I'm glad it's helping. But it wasn't fine. And we both knew it. The next few days, Yahir changed. He wasn't just polite anymore. He was attentive. Too attentive. He lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, offering to help even when I didn't need it. He complimented my hair, my clothes, even the way I laughed. I told myself he was just being nice, that it was harmless. But deep down I knew better. The worst part? I liked it. For the first time in months, someone noticed me. Not just as a wife or a stepmother, but as a woman. And that terrified me. Then came another text. This time it wasn't words. It was another video. I froze, my pulse quickening as I tapped the screen. I should have stopped it. I should have deleted it. But I didn't. I watched. And I hated myself for it. The next morning, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. But Yahir wouldn't let me. "Did you see what I sent you?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes locked on mine. I swallowed hard, turning back to the dishes. "You didn't mean to send it to me. What if I did?" I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Yahir, this isn't funny. I'm not joking." He stepped closer, his voice softer now. I feel like we understand each other more than anyone else in this house." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. Because he wasn't wrong. And that scared me more than anything. To be continued. I should have shut it down right then. Told him no. Told him to stop. But I didn't. Instead, I let the moment linger. I told myself it was harmless, just a boy with a crush. That he'd grow out of it. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only woman in the world, made it impossible to pull away. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying his words in my head. We understand each other. And the worst part? I felt it too. The tension only grew after that. Yahir started brushing past me in the kitchen, letting his hand linger just a second too long. He'd sit close to me on the couch, his knee barely touching mine, his breath warming the side of my neck. I told myself it was an accident, every single time. But it wasn't. Neither was the way I let it happen. One night, Edwin called to say he'd be away for another week. I hung up the phone, feeling the familiar ache of being invisible. Forgotten. And that's when Yahir walked in. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes too warm, too knowing. I nodded, but he didn't move. "Are you sure?" I couldn't speak. I just stood there as he stepped closer, so close I could feel his breath against my skin. "You deserve better," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And then it happened. His hand brushed my arm, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into it. It was quick. A touch. A lingering look. But it shattered every boundary I'd spent weeks trying to build. I pulled away first, my heart racing. "This can't happen," I said, but the words felt weak, like I didn't believe them myself. He didn't push. He just nodded. But the next day, I found another text waiting for me. "You don't have to feel alone." I deleted it without responding. But the damage was already done. Because as much as I wanted to ignore it, part of me didn't feel alone anymore. And that scared me more than anything. The tension between us didn't fade. If anything, it got worse. Yahir didn't hold back anymore. He didn't pretend to ignore the way I flushed when he touched me, or the way I couldn't meet his eyes after. One evening, Edwin called again to say he'd be home late. I pretended not to care, but deep down I felt it, the loneliness, the ache. And Yahir saw it. He stepped into the kitchen while I was cleaning up. "You shouldn't have to do all this alone," he said, taking the plate from my hand. I told him it was fine, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice softer. "You work so hard for everyone. But who takes care of you?" I froze. His words slipped under my skin, leaving me breathless. I tried to step away, but he caught my wrist, gentle but firm. "Tell me to stop," he said. I should have pulled away, screamed, anything. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, letting the moment stretch. My breathing quickened, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, hesitant, like he was testing me. But the second I didn't push him away, it changed. His hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and I let him. When it ended, we stood there, breathless, staring at each other like the world had just shifted. "This can't happen again," I whispered. But we both knew that was a lie. That night I lay awake, replaying every moment, every touch, every breath. I knew it was wrong. I knew I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. But I also knew I didn't want it to stop. And that terrified me. I told myself it was a mistake. A moment of weakness. But the next day it happened again. This time it wasn't subtle. Yahir caught me alone in the laundry room. I turned to leave, but he stepped in, closing the door behind him. My heart raced as he moved closer, his eyes locked on mine. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, steady. I swallowed hard. "About what?" "About this." He didn't wait. His hand slid along my waist, pulling me toward him. I didn't fight it. I should have, but I didn't. The moment his lips touched mine, I melted. It wasn't soft this time. It wasn't hesitant. It was raw and hungry, and I gave in completely. His hands moved over me, desperate, claiming, and I let him. I wanted him. Needed him. And it scared me how much. When it was over, we stood there, breathless, tangled in each other. But then the guilt hit. I pushed him away, my chest heaving. "This has to stop." He didn't move. "You don't mean that." His words hit me like a slap. Because he was right. I didn't mean it. I left the room without another word, but the damage was already done. That night, I avoided him again, locking myself in my bedroom, trying to pretend it never happened. But the next morning, he sent another text. "You don't have to run from this." From me. I deleted it, but my hands were shaking. Because as much as I wanted to fight it, part of me didn't want to run at all. To be continued. I couldn't keep running. No matter how much I tried to avoid him, Yahir wouldn't let me. And the truth? I didn't want him to. The next night, Edwin was working late again. Nixon was out with friends. It was just me and Yahir, alone in the house. I told myself to keep my distance. But when I walked into the living room, he was already there, waiting. "You don't have to pretend," he said softly. I froze, my breath catching. "Pretend what?" "That you don't want this." He stepped closer, and this time I didn't stop him. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me in, and I let him. The moment our lips touched, the tension exploded. His hands were everywhere, desperate, greedy. And I gave in completely. I didn't think about Edwin. I didn't think about consequences. I just let myself feel, his breath against my skin, the heat of his touch, the way he made me forget everything else. It was wrong. So wrong. But it felt too good to stop. When it was over, I lay there, tangled in the sheets, guilt swirling in my chest. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, but my voice was weak, barely convincing even to myself. Yahir didn't argue. He just looked at me, his eyes dark and full of something dangerous. "We already are." And he was right. There was no turning back now. The days blurred after that night. I told myself it was over. But it wasn't. Yahir knew it too. He didn't hide his touches anymore. The way his fingers brushed mine when he passed me a plate at dinner, the way his hand lingered on my back when he walked by. And I let him. Even when Nixon started noticing. It was small at first, side glances, raised eyebrows, little smirks he didn't bother to hide. Then one night it changed. I was in the kitchen cleaning up when Nixon walked in, his phone in hand. "You and Yahir have been spending a lot of time together," he said casually, but there was nothing casual about his tone. I froze, forcing a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous." He didn't smile. Instead, he held up his phone and hit play. My blood turned to ice. It was grainy but clear, me and Yahir. Together. My stomach dropped. "Nixon." He cut me off, his voice sharp. "Relax. I'm not sending it to Dad." I exhaled in relief. Too soon. "But you're going to do something for me." His words hit me like a punch. I wanted to scream, to rip the phone out of his hand. But I couldn't. He knew it. "I'll delete it," Nixon said, his smirk growing. "But it's going to cost you." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" His eyes flicked down my body before settling back on mine. "You'll find out." And just like that, I knew my nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Nixon didn't waste time. The next morning, he cornered me in the hallway, smiling like he owned me. "You didn't think I'd let this slide for free, did you?" he said, his voice low. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him no. But the image of that video played in my head. "You promised to delete it," I said, barely holding myself together. "And I will." His smirk deepened. "Once I get what I want." I swallowed hard. "What do you want?" His eyes darkened. "Your time. Your attention. Just like Yahir gets." I froze. "Are you serious?" As a heart attack. I tried to push past him, but he caught my wrist, pulling me back. "You don't have a choice, Elena." His words were sharp. Final. And he was right. I didn't. That night, I did what he asked. I sat with him on the couch, letting him talk to me, letting his hand rest on my thigh longer than it should have. And Yahir noticed. He cornered me later, his jaw tight, his voice sharp. "What's going on with you and Nixon?" "Nothing. Don't lie to me." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell him the truth. So I stayed silent. His eyes searched mine, and I could see it. The hurt, the anger. "You're hiding something," he said. And he was right. But before I could respond, Nixon appeared behind him, smirking. "Relax, Yahir. We're just getting to know each other better." Yahir's fists clenched, but I grabbed his arm before he could react. "Don't." He looked at me, confused and angry, but I couldn't explain, not without making it worse. Nixon leaned closer, whispering, "Careful, Elena. You wouldn't want him finding out the truth." I felt sick. Everything was spiraling out of control. And I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt. The fear. The secrets. Nixon's demands kept growing. Late-night texts. Lingering touches when no one was watching. Constant reminders that he owned me now. And Yahir, he wasn't letting go either. He cornered me in the laundry room one night, his voice low and sharp. "Tell me what's going on." I tried to push past him, but he wouldn't move. "Is it Nixon?" His eyes burned into mine. Is he blackmailing you? I froze. His expression shifted, anger flashing into something darker. I'll kill him, he said. No. I grabbed his arm, panicked. You can't. You're protecting him? I'm protecting you. I didn't realize I was crying until he wiped a tear off my cheek. Elena, his voice softened, but it only made it worse. Because I couldn't protect him. Not from this. And then Nixon appeared. He leaned against the doorway, his smirk as sharp as ever. Trouble in paradise? Yahir lunged at him, but Nixon didn't flinch. Go ahead, Nixon said. Hit me. But it won't stop me from showing Dad the video. Yahir froze, his chest heaving. I stepped between them. Stop. Nixon's smirk deepened. Good girl. And I snapped. No more. My voice shook, but I didn't care. You don't control me, Nixon. Not anymore. His smile faltered. You really want to test me? I don't care. Do it. Show the video. Destroy me. I was shaking, but I didn't stop. Because I'd rather lose everything than let you hold this over me one more second. For the first time, Nixon looked nervous. Yahir stepped closer. Delete it. Now. And Nixon did. But the damage was already done. Yahir didn't look at me the same after that. Neither did I. When Edwin came home, I pretended everything was fine. I cooked dinner, cleaned the house, and smiled like nothing had happened. But it was all broken. I was broken. And as much as I wanted to fix it, I knew I never could. Because some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.